Welcome to Dear SQL DBA, a podcast and YouTube show for SQL Server developers and database administrators. I'm Kendra Little from SQLWorkbooks.com. In today's episode, we are talking about batch mode in SQL Server, and we're also talking about hacking SQL Server to make it use batch mode. This week's question is, what is batch mode? And can I make SQL Server use it? Well, batch mode is a feature that got introduced with column store indexes in SQL Server, and it's still very strongly related to column store indexes. Traditionally in SQL Server, we had just row store indexes. We didn't call them row store because they were we just called them indexes. But everything was based around rows. And in row store indexes, we've got 8K pages, and they're lined up in a lovely, balanced, organized B tree. When column store indexes were introduced, they were introduced because for a lot of queries in SQL Server, we want to read all of the data in a column and do something with it. We want to sort it or sum it up or do some kind of aggregate on it. We want to analyze it, and we want to look at either a whole lot of data in the column or often the whole column. Column store indexes store data in a totally separate format. Everything is based on columns. It compresses the data. It divides it up into big old row groups. And when we got column store indexes, they didn't come alone. They came along with batch mode. Because if we're doing all this cool work to store data in columns, hey, maybe there are new ways that we can process the data that aren't based on just looking at a single row either. That is batch mode. Batch mode, when you have it on an operator in a SQL Server query, it can work on more than just one row. It will work on batches of up to 900 values. Working on batches, when we're doing things like sorting or joining a lot of data or aggregating data, it can have advantages because it can have less overhead. It can improve CPU utilization. Batch mode can be screaming fast. But it is weird in terms of, can I make SQL Server use batch mode? Because it does still have that association with column store indexes. Right now, in SQL Server 2016 Service Pack 1, you won't just get batch mode operators on any query against any table. But over the years, folks have come up with some very clever tricks and hacks to get SQL Server to use batch mode operators, even when you look around the query execution plan and you're like, I don't see any column store indexes in this plan. And part of the secret is to get batch mode. As of right now, we're in this weird state with batch mode where to get batch mode operators, you don't actually have to have a column store index in the plan. Your query has to in some way refer to a table that has a column store index on it. That column store index doesn't necessarily have to have any rows, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be a join that actually shows up in the plan. It might get factored out by the optimizer, right? So it's some interesting hacks and tricks that we're gonna talk through about how you can trick SQL Server into using batch mode. But you've got to be careful if you use any of these hacks. Because generally with hacks, you're not really guaranteed that your hack is going to be honored or supported in new versions of SQL Server. So if you start hacking in batch mode against your row store indexes, every time you upgrade your SQL Server or just go out for a coffee, you need to check, hey, is my hack still working? Because, hacks are not generally supported user stories. I'm going to talk you through an example of where batch mode makes a big difference for a query, and we'll see different hacks and options for making it work. Now, if you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, I'm going to totally talk you through the demo. Don't worry that you can't see it on the screen. I will make it make sense. Our problem query today is running against the Babby Names database. And it's even running against the little Babby Names database. I've got 2 copies of this sample database up on GitHub. And the little one is only 41 megs to download. This demo works against that. So I've restored the database. I've created an index against the ag.firstname by year state table. Now, ag.firstname by year state contains aggregate information about babies born in every state in the United States. And here's an example. So for the first name ID associated with Kendra for the state of Oregon, there will be a row for all the girl babies born in 2016. And if there were boy babies born in Oregon with the name Kendra in 2016, they'll have their own row there. And the row has a column named name count that contains information about the total number of babies with that name in that state code for that gender. We've got a procedure named popular names that I've already created. And popular names is not beautiful code. Like a lot of code in the world, it has some personality issues on purpose. And it's not doing something that's necessarily simple either. What it does is it takes a threshold parameter. And it uses that threshold parameter to figure out when a name broke through a certain value based on a running total. So for example, if I pass in the threshold 100,000, what it's going to do is look at for each name in each state for each gender from the beginning of reporting for that name. How many total babies have been born with that name, and at what point do they pass 100,000 in that state for that gender? So it's got to do a running total for every first name ID in the database and then also report out at what year it crossed that threshold. So it's got to look at the value for that year and then the value for the year before, because hey, if my running total right now is 101,000, maybe there was just one baby born this year and I actually passed that threshold a few years back. So it's got a lot of work to do here. I have already run our query because this query, when I run this against the table, it uses my non-clustered index, but this query takes more than a minute to run, even when all the data is in memory. It takes, in this case, it took 76 seconds of elapsed time and 73 seconds of CPU time to run the query. And when I look in my execution plan, I can see that we did a lot of work on this query with windowing functions. It scanned my non-clustered index on the table, and then it fed the data through segment operators, a window spool, a stream aggregate. There's practically a partridge in a pear tree here. Well, how can I tell if my query used batch mode? When you highlight an operator and look at the properties, and this will also often show in the tooltip as well, there is information in the properties about actual execution mode. And if it says actual execution mode is row, and in my case it did, we used row mode, not batch mode. So my index scan operator used row mode. My segment operator used row mode. My window spool operator used row mode. I don't have a Columnstore index anywhere on this table, nowhere on it. So the only thing available to this query right now is row mode. So this isn't a surprise that it didn't use batch mode. I'm going to create first a goofy Columnstore index. On my table, I am creating a non-clustered Columnstore index just on the state code column. Now, this is a little weird, right? I'm just on state code, I'm creating a Columnstore. So I've got overhead for modifications, right? Everything I do with this, it's now gonna have to deal with the Columnstore index, and it's not even gonna be very useful because it's just on one column. But just for our initial demo, we're doing this. Now, I'm going to rerun popular names with the exact same threshold. I haven't changed any code at all. It's still running with 100,000 as the threshold. And just by adding that column store index, my query now finishes in 2 seconds. It was over a minute before, and now it's done in 2 seconds. Looking at my execution plan, there is no column store index in the plan. My column store index is just on state code, and it was like, you're using way more columns than that. So it did an index scan on my row store non-clustered index, and it did a clustered index seek on my row store table on first name, but it didn't use the column store index. But I have different operators in this plan. I have now window aggregate operators. I did not have this exact operator in my plan before. And not only do I have a window aggregate operator, when I look at the actual execution mode for this operator, it is a batch mode operator. In fact, this window aggregate operator is a new 2016 fancy batch mode windowing operator. So I got like new fancy stuff, even though it didn't use my column store index. And when I look at other operators, when I look at my compute scalar, it's in batch mode. I have a second window aggregate option because of my lag. Hey, that's doing batch mode too. I've got batch mode on my filter. I've got batch mode on my sort. I am having a batch mode party in my query, and it's a minute faster too. So it worked out pretty well for me. Well, what if I wanted to make sure that it didn't use the column store index? I am now going to create a procedure that is the exact same code, but with the addition of a hint. At the end of the procedure, I have added option ignore non-clustered column store index. SQL Server, you are not allowed to use my non-clustered column store index. Well, and I've named this procedure popular names with a hint. I'm going to just look at the estimated execution plan for popular names with a hint. When I look at this estimated plan, I can see, well, I'm doing an index scan of the row store index again. That's the same. But when I look, I don't have those. I don't have that fancy batch mode operator for the window aggregate anymore. I'm back to a segment operator, a window spool, and a stream aggregate. And when I look at the properties of my segment operator, I'm now in an estimated execution plan. So I have estimated execution mode, and it is row. Now that I added a hint, I hinted away and I said, ignore the non-clustered column store index. SQL Server 2016 Service Pack 1 was like, oh, no column store, you're in row mode only. I don't get the cool new batch mode window aggregate operator. And all my other operators are in row mode, and I'm back to the version of my query that takes over a minute to run. Well, let's see. How can we get around this? Now, Nico is from Portugal, and let's call him Nico N, because I need to learn how to pronounce Nico's last name, but I'm still a total amateur. He has a great article on this where he's been working with column store indexes for a while and been hacking around with column store indexes for a while too. And he had some cases with SQL Server 2014 where he had hints in place and it would still use batch mode. With SQL Server 2016 is when it started saying, oh, if you're using those hints, no more batch mode for you. So he had some cases of regression. So in his article, he points out in some cases you could potentially, by lowering your database compatibility level on SQL Server 2016, by lowering it to 120, you could potentially get batch mode back even if you have this hint in place. But he points out, you probably don't want to do this because SQL Server 2016 has a bunch of improvements for batch mode, including things like this window aggregate operator that I was showing. It is a feature in 2016. It's not gonna even be available for me at a lower compat level. But there's other improvements as well. So just this workaround / hack of lowering the compat mode, I wouldn't jump for that one. I wouldn't jump for that one at all. Really, he has some great example code in his article though, and I'll have a link for that at the end of the session and on the blog post for this episode as well. So compat mode, you might in some cases, but I don't like the idea of dropping the compat mode. It's like trying to make it faster, but then other things you're likely to make slower. So there's other ways. We don't have to have that hint. I'm going to drop my goofy column store index, my non-clustered column store that was just on one column. That is lame. Don't do that. There's other more interesting hacks. Here is a hack that I learned about from Itzik Ben-Gan, and I don't know if he's the one who invented this. He probably is. I'm creating a non-clustered column store index on ag.firstname by year state. And I'm just putting it on one column. It doesn't really matter because what I'm doing at the end of it is I'm putting a filter on. My filter is where first name ID equals -1 and first name ID equals -2. So I've put an impossible filter on here. I've said create a filtered column store index. We got the filtered column store index feature in 2016. Create a non-clustered column store index with a filter that says first name ID is -1 and it's also -2. So I am not going to have I can't have any rows qualify for this column store index at all. And if I look at my metadata with sysobjects and sys.dmdb partition stats, I have 0 rows in my column store index and I have 9 pages reserved for it. So I have spent 9 pages and inserts, updates, and deletes. I mean, nothing's going to qualify for this. So no rows will go into this. I'm going to run my original code on the popular names table and with a threshold of 100,000. And sure enough, it is 2 seconds. And when I look at the execution plan, I don't have to hint this away because my column store index, my filtered column store index is so ridiculous. I think I can be fairly certain SQL Server isn't going to go for it. I have an index scan on my non-clustered row store index. I've got my fancy batch mode window aggregate operators back, and I've got my 2-second plan. So the column store index with the impossible filter is way more elegant of a hack than my, first thing of just normal one column store index. So Itzik's filtered impossible filter does the trick. And I didn't have to change my code at all to get it to use that. So I'm going to drop that column store index because what if I don't have SQL Server 2016? What if I have SQL Server 2014 and I want to hack around this, for example? Well, Itzik wrote about another hack that he learned about from Nico. I've also seen a Stack Overflow answer that Paul White wrote where he referred to this hack too. So I don't know if Paul White came up with this or Nico came up. I don't know who you can thank or blame for this hack. But the hack is just to create a separate table. And I'm going to name my table DBO.hack. It's got 1 column in it, which is an integer with an identity value. But I'm not going to put any rows in it. I'm creating the table hack, which has 0 rows in it, and I'm creating a non-clustered column store index on just the 1 column it has that's named I. So it is a totally empty table named hack. And now I'm going to create a procedure named popular names with a bogus join. Popular names with a bogus join is It's a lovely query. It's our original query, but it has one join that has been added. The join is left join DBO.hack on 1 equals 0. So I'm adding in a left outer join to hack on 1 equals 0. And SQL Server, this is valid T-SQL. My stored procedure has compiled. And let's go ahead and run this and see what SQL Server thinks of my bogus join. Well, SQL Server looks at my bogus join and it says 1 does not equal 0, so no rows are going to come back from that. I am just going to throw that. I don't need to process that. So I don't have DBO.hack anywhere in my execution plan. My hack is invisible, in the plan at least. It's in the T-SQL, but it's not in the plan. I have an index scan against my row store non-clustered index. I've got my fancy batch mode window aggregate operators. I've got all the goodness. I've got no DBO.hack anywhere in there. So this hack does require changing my T-SQL. Do I even need a real table? Well, let's see. What if we create a temp table named hack? And we can create a non-clustered column store index on temporary hack too. I'm gonna recreate my procedure and now I've got left join temp table hack on 1 equals 0. It works the exact same way. Testing that, it's like, okay, well, I don't need to process that join to that temp table, but hey, I smelled the column store index. I sensed that something you join to, even if it's ridiculous and gets thrown out, it had column store, so I've got a batch mode option and I get my 2-second query run with temp table hack. So there's a variety of ways to trick SQL Server into batch mode and to get that, but I do have to do something definitely weird. So summing up the different most popular ways that you can hack in batch mode, I think the coolest one at this point is the one that ITSIC publicized with the empty filtered non-clustered column store index. And the reason that that's so cool is I didn't have to change the code in the query and it doesn't have any rows on it, right? So in terms of like overhead for modifications, I don't have inserts, updates, and deletes happening in my non-clustered column store index. Now, of course, for trick number 2, the bogus join to a table with column store that, the bogus join actually gets thrown out by the optimizer, that bogus table with column store doesn't have any insert, update, and delete overhead either because I'm just leaving it empty and doing, bogus left join to it. But that does require changing my code to reference it. On the other hand, it doesn't require SQL Server 2016, so that makes it a little bit more flexible in terms of versions. Hack number 3, in some cases, if you've got like a hint in play, getting, saying, oh, well, SQL Server 2016, compat level 130 doesn't want to do this, so I'm going to lower the compat level. Now, this is in the case where you do still have to have a column store index in play, like it has to exist, but like this is a case where SQL Server doesn't want to use it because you're hinting a row store index, for example. I don't like the workaround of let's make it use batch mode. I would rather try to figure out, can I remove the hint or in some way trick it without having to lower the compat mode, just because that compat mode of 130, when it comes to using batch mode, we got all sorts of cool new features with it. You're giving up a lot by lowering your compat level. So that doesn't come for free. I don't really like that hack. And I want to make it clear I'm not saying just go to compat level 120. When you're talking about column store and you're talking about batch mode, having access to the latest and greatest innovations means Compat level 130. So forward. Well, why do we have to use these hacks? Why don't we just have batch mode for everything? This problem sounds, I've made this sound simple and I've talked about, hey, there's this query where it makes it much faster. Batch mode isn't going to be perfect for every query. And if it's just started getting turned on for single row lookups, it's absolutely not hard to imagine places where there could be big regressions. And for certain workloads, there could be problems. So you got to test carefully with this. And this is something that Microsoft's working on. Nico filed a bug in the Microsoft Connect system. And in the bug, he says, I would love to see, it's a feature request rather than a bug, actually. I think technically it's a suggestion. So it's not like, hey, I filed a bug that you didn't do this. It's a suggestion and he says, hey, it would be great if we had batch mode operators for row store. And he talks about why that would be helpful. There's a response from Microsoft on this. And a developer updates the ticket saying, hey, Nico, I'm working on this feature right now. It won't make the next version, which this was written in March of 2017. So next version, SQL Server 2017, I believe. But he says, I'd really like to talk to you about what use cases you see for it. There's more to the work than just enabling the optimizer to consider batch mode plans over row store. And he says, hey, I'd like to start an offline conversation. So it sounds like this is going to happen and that there's going to become a time where you're not having to do weirdo hacks to get these batch mode operators into place. So if you hear this and you're like, oh, you know what? I'm just going to wait for a time when I don't have to do something bizarre. I totally feel you. And I kind of feel that way too, because the thing about using hacks is when they backfire on you, you're left in this situation where you're like, yeah, I was using this bizarre hack. Now, if Columnstore indexes actually help you, I also want to say this too, like using columns, sometimes you should just test and use Columnstore indexes. So if you're like, hey, maybe I have a bunch of queries where maybe this would help, also consider if potentially just Columnstore indexes could help you too. Because we do now have, since SQL Server 2016 Service Pack 1, we have licensing changes where we can use Columnstore indexes in lower editions, in standard edition, and there are some limits to how much memory you can have, how much parallelism you can use with them, but we can start using these in not expensive edition of SQL Server. So if you're thinking about all the things you might do, don't just be obsessed about batch mode on row store. Also think about batch mode on Columnstore too. Don't ignore what could be, in fact, the coolest thing. So links, if you're interested in this, there's lots of great things to read up on. The Columnstore Indexes query performance article in Books Online is great. It talks a lot about not just batch mode, but also like predicate pushdown, lots of other cool processing features with Columnstore indexes. Nico's great article on important batch mode changes in SQL Server 2016 has example code around that hint issue where like, hey, if I'm hinting away the Columnstore index, suddenly batch mode goes away too. And Nico's whole blog is a fantastic resource on Columnstore in general. Itzhak Ben-Ghan's article, What You Need to Know About the Batch Mode Window Aggregate Operator in SQL Server 2016, it's where he starts talking about the big improvements in windowing function operators, as well as talks about that weird filtered non-clustered Columnstore index hack. And then Paul White has a great answer on dba.stackexchange.com. What exactly can SQL Server 2014 execute in batch mode? I would also encourage you to vote up Nico's Connect item saying, hey, we would love to have batch mode operators on row store, because even though we had an update that it was being worked on, like votes only ever help. right? And developer time is precious. So if you're like, yeah, I want this, hit up the blog post on littlekendra.com or find I'm going to post some of the demo code for this to SQLworkbooks.com too. Vote up that Connect item. It's number 938021. And say, yes, I would like this too. Thank you for joining me this week for Dear SQL DBA. I am Kendra Little from SQLworkbooks.com, and it is always a pleasure to record this. I'll see you again next week.